Everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you to today's session, the second session of our fall series on dangerous ideas, censorship through a Jewish lens. Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. We're so happy to have Rabbi Eliezer Diamond teaching us today on suppressed Talmudic and medieval polemics against Jesus. So a scintillating topic for many people, and I'm sure we will leave this session with a much more nuanced view, or with a lot of information and in a nuanced way, a nuanced understanding of how Jesus was related to in the rabbinic and medieval period. So thank you in advance, Rabbi Diamond, for teaching us. I also want to thank our sponsors for today at the Chacham level, Lenore and Rabbi Melvin Cerner, who are sponsoring in memory of their beloved sister and sister-in-law, Rabbi Amy Mayer. And Rabbi Amy Mayer was actually, we were in rabbinical school together, and it was, I'm really pleased, Rabbi Cerner and Lenore, that you're sponsoring in her memory today. She was a very special person who made an impact and will really be missed. So thank you very much. And we want to invite anyone else who's feeling inspired by this learning with GTS faculty to consider sponsoring a session as well at any of our three levels. Chacham is $540, Sadiq is $1,000, and Navi is $1,800. We're posting information on that in the chat. So now I'll turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman for a bit more information before we begin.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over the format of our session, Rabbi Diamond will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. You can chat your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman, and she will select a few questions to present to Rabbi Diamond. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today, and we'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Rabbi Diamond. Rabbi Eliezer Diamond is the Rabbi Judah Nadich Associate Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS. He teaches courses in rabbinic literature and Talmud studies. Rabbi Diamond has written on prayer, asceticism, and issues of environmental law and ethics. He has taught in a variety of settings, including Stern College, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, the 92nd Street Y, and several Roma camps. He's taught several times as part of these series, and we're really pleased to have him teaching for us again today. So, Rabbi Diamond, I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good afternoon to everyone who is online. So I like to be a teacher of Torah, and why is it relevant here? We will be looking at the material through a historical lens, these anti-gospels as I describe them, but lest we come away feeling dispirited at the end, I want to look at some later assessments or reassessments of Jesus briefly. We'll see that Maimonides is a sort of reassessment, and then in the 20th and 21st centuries, there are further reassessments, so that now there has been some kind of, let's call it, reconciliation between the Jewish community and Jesus and how Jesus is seen. Not so much in the sources that we will be studying most of the time. So I want to start by saying, I don't know about you, but most discussions of religion and politics in which I have participated are basically about people talking past each other. There's no real chance that one party is going to convince the other. And as I've heard said, Jews don't listen, they wait. So I mention that because to understand the role of these anti-Jesus passages in the Talmud, and we'll see that there is a full anti-gospel by the name of Toledot Yeshu, the story of Jesus, or as I like to call it, the Jesus Chronicles. We will see that it's not about discussion. It's a tactic. And let me say more about that. So in the Talmud, the rabbis say, mockery is forbidden, but mockery of idolatry is permitted. In other words, we don't really expect, or the rabbis didn't really expect, to be able to show idolaters the errors of their way. And so they used mockery, which is a form of subversive chipping away at the arguments and practices of your opponent. You're not really proving anything, but you are presenting what they think and do in a negative light that suggests that what they're doing is ridiculous. And even though you are not going to convince those who are doing it that they're wrong, you can get a certain satisfaction yourself out of having made your opponent look ridiculous. And the second thing I want to say before we begin is that the audience for the anti-Jesus comments in the Talmud, and less so for the Jesus Chronicles, Toledot Yeshu, as we'll see, but certainly the comments in the Talmud, are not Christians, because Christians are not going to be studying Talmud. For the most part, the Christians only discovered Talmud in the 13th century, as we'll see. So who is really the audience? I would say, to some extent, the audience is Jews. That is, to the extent that Jews wondered, is ours the true religion? Do the Christians, are they right in some sense? So for that audience, it was important to ridicule Jesus and Christianity, saying in effect to Jews, you couldn't possibly convert to Christianity. Look how ridiculous it is. So now what I want to do is look at a couple of passages, I'm going to screen share, from both the Talmud and let me find it, and where is it now? Where is it? Okay, let me try again. I don't know why it's not there. All right, sorry about this. I had it opened and now it's not open. Okay. Okay, Tani or somebody, could you share the sources? I don't know what's going on. Oh, wait. Sorry, I got it. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of these sources. And I want to emphasize that for Jews, there were two parts of the story of Jesus as presented in the Gospels that was particularly troubling. One was the story of the virgin birth. Two, the story of resurrection. Why were these particularly troubling or challenging? Well, one is, to the extent that it could be claimed that Jesus was more than human, Son of God, semi-deity, however we want to see Jesus and how different groups saw Jesus, right? It depended on believing in the virgin birth and believing that Jesus rose, that Jesus was resurrected. And we have to understand that neither of those ideas was foreign to Jews in the rabbinic period. I mean, let's think about the first one, the idea of the virgin birth. We don't have any virgin births, but we do have cases where God comes and informs people that a child will be born and will have some kind of special status or role. And I think particularly of Sarah, who we are told is too old to give birth. And God says, no, nothing is impossible for God. So she can have a child when she's 90 years old. Well, if you keep following that train of thought, if God can allow a woman who's past her childbearing years to have a child, who's to say that a child can't be born in parthenogenesis without a relationship between a man and a woman? As far as resurrection is concerned, although, best of my knowledge, we don't have anyone who dies and then rises again, we do have the doctrine of Tchiyat HaMetim, the idea that the dead can and will in the future rise up once again. And we have a number of individuals who do not die but ascend to heaven. One is Elijah, right, who ascends in a fiery chariot, and we know he's still around because he visits our Seder every year. And according to Malachi, he will be the herald of the end of days. So he seems to be a figure who transcends death. Another example, less well known, is Enoch at the beginning of Genesis, Hanoch, about whom we're told, V'einenu, he no longer was on earth, Ki lakach oto Elokim, because God took him up into heaven. And without going into many details, there are books of Enoch where this idea is developed further as Enoch, some kind of not fully human, but also not a god, who, by the way, in the form of Metatron, which is one of the names that he's given, serves as a sort of mediator between the heavens and the human realm, not unlike the personality of Jesus as the Christians saw it. So what I want to do now is look at texts. We'll look at gospel texts, and then we'll look at texts from the Talmud and also from the Jesus Chronicles, and we'll see how they interact with each other. The Talmudic texts are mostly from seem to be written mostly in Babylonia rather than in Eretz Yisrael, which at first blush is somewhat surprising. But most scholars explain that Jews in Bavel would have been more comfortable writing anti-Jesus passages because they weren't under the Romans, who eventually became accepted Christianity as the official religion. Christians always remained a minority in Bavel in the Sasanian Empire. So in any case, we find many more anti-Jesus passages in the Talmud than in the Babylonian Talmud than we find in Palestinian sources. The Toledot Yeshu, the Jesus Chronicles, seem to have been written, I'll come back to that, in the 6th century, also in Bavel. But when we say written, the original language seems to have been Aramaic. And the term written is not totally appropriate because there are so many collections that we can put under the title of Toledot Yeshu, because these seem to be stories that were told, that were gathered together in different forms and by different groups. So therefore, the collections of these stories, these various anthologies of these stories, is very different from one manuscript to another. Okay, so let's start with the birth of Jesus and the virgin birth, and let's look at Matthew 1. Now, the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, which we should probably understood as being betrothed, which means, according to Jewish law, that she was already considered married, but they had not consummated the marriage by living together, as we now read, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Well, the author of the gospel is adding the Holy Spirit part. Her husband, Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. And here, there's something important in that the writers of the gospel understood that if you said to the average person, oh, this was a virgin birth, they would be more likely to say, give me a break. This woman is an adulteress. She had a relationship with someone else. The idea of a virgin birth is ridiculous. But in the Gospels, just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. And we now read all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. This is a theme that repeats itself again and again in the Gospels, that events are seen as fulfillment of biblical verses. Here we have a verse from Isaiah. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Joseph awoke from sleep. He did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. So that's the gospel version. Now we have a statement in the Babylonian Talmud in Shabbat 104b, which discusses the pedigree, as it were, of Jesus. And the Talmud says, is Jesus the son of Stada? This is a continuation of a previous discussion where Jesus is referred to. He is the son of Pandera, or if you prefer, Panthera, a panther, which some have pointed out is perhaps a mocking way of referring to Parthenos, virgin. So Rav Chisda says, the husband was Stada and the lover was Pandera or Panthera. In other words, what is the view being presented in the Talmud? There's no virgin birth here. What happens is Mary has sexual relations with someone other than her husband, and depending what version of Toledot Yeshu you look at, she was raped, she was deceived, she willingly participated in a sexual relationship with this person. In any case, the husband was Stada and the lover was Panthera. Now the Talmud says, no, that doesn't make sense either, because we have a tradition that the husband was Papos, son of Yehuda, and the mother Stada. So it wasn't the husband's name Stada, it was the mother's name. So the Talmud says, no, his mother was Miriam the hairdresser and was called Stada. And so in fact, it was the wife who was called Stada. As they say in Pumbedita about her, she was unfaithful to her husband, Satat da Mibala. In other words, the name Stada is a compressed form of this statement. She veered away. She was unfaithful to her husband. Satat is related to the word sota, a woman suspected of adultery. So the rabbis agreed to the facts. In other words, the fact is that Jesus was born of Mary, without her having relations with her husband. The only thing is, this had nothing to do with virgin birth. It was simply that, willingly or not, she had a relationship with someone else. And we should note that Panthera, in part based on the name, and in part, this is a tradition in some versions of Toledot Yeshu, was a Roman soldier, which means that not only was Jesus an illegitimate child, Jesus was also the son of a non-Jewish father. So that's a further diminishment of his status. Okay, I want to move on to what the sources have to say about, let's see what time it is. Okay, let's look at this as well. So the next question is, Jesus as a disciple of the sages. That is, in the Gospels, Jesus is presented as studying with the elders, but then being so brilliant that he is able to teach them. What we will see is that in the Talmud, he is indeed a student of the rabbis, but a student gone wrong, let's put it that way. So we have here in chapter 2 of Luke, every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom, and then the parents leave, and they thought Jesus was with them, but in fact, he stayed behind in Jerusalem, and they were unaware of it and questioned what they're parenting. So they go back to Jerusalem to look for him. And if you look at the bolded verse 46, after 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. This is a trope that we often find in Jewish sources and in religious sources of other religions. You have the prodigy. He's only 12 years old. He comes to the temple to sit at the feet of the elders, but at the end of the day, he not only understands what they say, but he's able to provide good questions and even good answers. So in some sense, he surpasses the understanding of the sages. That's the Gospels. Now we have a story in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 107b. And the story comes in the context of talking about cases where masters treat their disciples harshly, and the Talmud says they should not do so. And they give two examples of this. One is the prophet Elisha, who pushed away his disciple Gehazi, and the other example is Joshua ben Parachia, who, according to the Mishnah, lived sometime in the 2nd century BCE, who pushed away Yeshu. So Yeshu, Jesus, was a disciple of one of the sages. And then we are told, and I'm going to skip over the story and just summarize it for you. There was a king, Hasmonean king, from 103 to 76, Alexander Jannaeus, who became an enemy of the Pharisees and killed many of them. And for that reason, Joshua ben Parachia and his student Jesus ran away to Egypt. A rabbi who was in the land of Israel at some point told Joshua ben Parachia, you don't have to worry, problem solved, come back to Eretz Yisrael. And now look at the bolded section. When Joshua ben Parachia returned from Egypt, he and Yeshu arrived at an inn. The innkeeper stood before him with exemplary honor and accorded him great honors. Joshua sat and was praising them, or really praising the inn, saying how beautiful this inn is. And the word is achsania, which can mean the inn itself, but also can mean the innkeepers. Rabbi Yeshu said to him, "My master, her eyes are narrow." So he's looking at the female innkeeper and he's saying, no, when you're saying that she's beautiful, actually, she's not so beautiful because look at her eyes. And as I say here, the Aramaic words for inn and innkeeper were the same. So Joshua said to him, "Wicked one, is that how you conduct yourself?" He brought out 400 shofarot and excommunicated him. There is more to the story. Every day Yeshu would come before him, but Joshua did not accept him. And the end of the story is that at a certain point, Joshua was ready to accept Jesus back, but he was saying the Shema, and so he made a gesture by which he meant, hang on a second. Jesus thought he was rejecting him, and so what happens? Jesus goes off because he thought Yeshua ben Prachia was rejecting him. Jesus, Yeshu, went and erected brickwork, not sure what that means, and worshipped it as an idol. So whereas Jesus, according to this passage in the Talmud, starts out as a student of the rabbis, he ends up being rejected and becomes an idol worshiper. So again, in the Gospels, yes, Jesus is a disciple of the sages. In the Gospels, he's brilliant and he outshines the other disciples. In the Talmud, yes, he is a disciple of the rabbis or a rabbi, but he's a disciple gone wrong. And notice in the previous Talmudic passage, and also in this passage, there is the theme of promiscuity. This is true in a lot of the anti-Jesus chronicles, right? So in the first one, there's no virgin birth because adultery took place, willingly or otherwise. In this passage, rather than praising the inn, Jesus is paying attention to the innkeeper, and he's sort of checking her out and rating her. She's a 8, she's a 10, she's not a 10 because her eyes are narrow. So this is a theme that we often encounter. Let's move on to the next issue, which is, what were the sources of Jesus' powers? So clearly, Jesus himself claimed that his powers were given to him by his Father, the Father, by God. And the very use of the name, of his name, had great powers. So for example, in Mark, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, which is another way in which Jesus cures people, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" And now the blind man says, he looked up and he says, "Yes, I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't even go into the village." So this is just one instance of Jesus being a healer. And this is something that comes up very, very often. And there is a book in the name about the passages in the Talmud. And it's a book worth reading if you're interested in this topic. It's called Jesus in the Talmud by Peter Schaefer. And it's, oh, you can't see it because when I stop sharing, I'll show it to you, which is a thorough study of all the Jesus passages in the Talmud. Okay, so for the Gospels, Jesus' power comes from his Father, in other words, from God. Not so according to the rabbis. In the first passage, the Talmud passage, we're told, And the master said, Jesus was a sorcerer who turned the people away from God and towards idolatry. Now we have to understand, in the rabbinic period, people believed, Jews believed, that people could do wondrous things by using sorcery, by using magic. So when you saw someone doing wondrous things, it was not clear necessarily whether this person was a sorcerer or whether he was a man, usually of God, and whose God had authorized. He was a conduit through which miracles were occurring. I think it was Jacob Neusner who once said, miracles are what happen in our religion, magic is what happens in other religions. The point is, it's hard to distinguish between them. So again, notice, the rabbis are agreeing. Jesus did wondrous things. He cured people, but his powers did not come from God, but through sorcery. And again, the major difference between magic and miracles is that magic is amoral. Once you have the tools to perform marriage, you can be a good person, an immoral person, it really doesn't matter. You are able to perform wonders. Whereas if you are performing miracles, it means that you are a man of God, and that is what enables you to do wonders. Okay, so we saw that the Talmud says that Jesus was a sorcerer. And now in Toledot Yeshu, okay, we read the following. Jesus withdrew himself to the temple precincts. Now the express letters of God's ineffable name were written on the foundation stone, Even Shetiyah, within the Holy of Holies, because in the Second Temple period, there was no ark in the Holy of Holies, just this foundation stone, which was the place where it was at the center of the world, according to rabbinic belief. And anyone who learned the letters of this name, anyone who learned them, could do by them whatsoever he wished. But moreover, the nation of Israel used to fear lest the wicked of Israel should learn them and thereby destroy the world. In other words, they were afraid of someone using God's name in the manner of a magician, taking hold of the name and being able to perform wonders. So it was that they made 2 bronze dogs and had them tied at the entrance to the temple sanctuary. And anyone who learned the express letters of the divine name and then went out of the sanctuary, when he saw the dogs, would forget from his heart that which he learned. So if I go into the temple, I see what the ineffable name of God is, and I memorize it. And then I leave the temple, these bronze dogs do whatever they do, they magically bark, and I forget the name. So in the interest of time, I'll tell you what Jesus does. Jesus goes into the inner part of the temple. He writes the name on a parchment, let's say. He makes a gash in his arm and sews the parchment into his arm. He then leaves the temple. So now it doesn't matter whether the dogs bark or they don't bark. All he has to do when he leaves the temple is open up the gash, and there is the name, and he is able to perform sorcery because he has that name. And if we look at the end of this passage, we're going to skip much of it. So he's performing these miracles, and the Jews say to him, if you are a Messiah, show us a sign. He said, what sign is it that you seek from me? They brought to him a lame man who had never yet stood upon his feet, whom, when Jesus had seen him, spoke over him the Shem HaMeforash, the express letters containing this name of God that should not be pronounced. and forthwith did he begin to walk. He did resurrect those who had been dead by the express letters of God's divine name, and the people of Israel were on his account in a state of consternation. In other words, we have dueling narratives here. The Gospels claiming that all the wonders that Jesus performed were miracles because he was empowered by God. Jews believing that it was sorcery, but Jews realizing that you couldn't really prove this. Was it sorcery? Was it through God? There was no absolute proof. So while they claimed that Jesus was a sorcerer, it was hard to argue against the view that, no, it's not sorcery, it's coming from God. Okay, let's stop and see if there are any questions. So stop share.
I'm just processing what you just said. You were saying,
Should I repeat it?
well, this is what I was wondering if you were saying this, so you could tell me if it's yes or no. That so as not to, right? We want to say it's sorcery, but so as not to kind of give that validity unto itself. They're saying it's sort of a misuse of sort of our own system of how God's name should and shouldn't be used.
Would do. You know that there's some tool that you can use to accomplish your means, and you know that the priests, the elders, why the dogs are there, and he has a workaround. So clearly what he's doing is not in accordance with the will of the Jewish leaders, and therefore presumably not in accordance with the will of God.
Thank you. Okay. So back when you sort of mentioned briefly close to the beginning about resurrection not particularly being a phenomenon that Jewish sources focus on. So many people asked right away about the prophet Elisha and the resurrecting the son of the Shunammite woman. So if you could just distinction.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I retract what I said, although there are those who say that he wasn't entirely dead. But you're right. Good point. Point well taken. So that would be an instance of resurrection taking place in Jewish sources.
I was expecting you to say it's on such a smaller scale. It's like an in the moment kind of thing. The person died and then. But
yeah, but my point is not so much to compare, let's say, Jesus' resurrection with, and by the way, I should say there is an important difference, which is Jesus' resurrection combines coming back to life with coming back to life as a spiritual and physical being, which is not true of the child in the Elisha story. It's still point well taken. That having been said, my point before was not, well, let's see, are they the same? But to say that these ideas in general were out there. And because these ideas were out there, claiming that Jesus was some kind of demigod, the Son of God, however we understand that, or that he rose up and was resurrected, were not ideas that were foreign to Jews at that time.
Thank you. There's so many questions of different kinds. I'm trying to start them all. Maybe someone asked about kind of the timeline of the different sources, and of course the rabbinic sources are happening over an extended period, as are the Gospels. But maybe you could just say a word about kind of the relative.
Yeah, okay. So the Gospels would be written anywhere from the end of the 1st century to sometime in the 2nd century. The Talmudic sources, the earliest is Nadich, which means that it dates from probably late 2nd century. The sources in the Babylonian Talmud are mostly in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The Toledot Yeshu, as I said before, the earliest manuscript of some form of Toledot Yeshu, which is in Aramaic, seems to be from the 6th century.
So on the whole, much later.
Yeah. Okay, should we resume?
Yeah, well, maybe can you take one more? Just
Yeah.
a little more substantive. Someone was asking about the Septuagint compacting or sort of conflating the different terms for young woman, virgin, etc. So the idea of a virgin birth, was a translation error. That's sort of a narrow question, but I think it's interesting because, right, the idea of something that arose from a translation error, kind of using that as sort of a strategy in kind of the approach of ridicule that you mentioned earlier, I thought was interesting. I don't know if are they kind of accepting that? Do they see that as a translation error? Are they accepting that? Are they sort of inventing their own misreadings or
The rabbis, who are we talking about now?
Yeah, the rabbis. Do they think of that as an error, or are they just, that's what it is, that's what's sort of out there?
I think, given that the Hebrew word is alma, it did not occur to the rabbis themselves that it was referring to a virgin giving birth. The term throughout the Bible would be betulah. So they would simply say, burden of proof is upon anyone who wants to claim that the verse means virgin. But again, just to go back to a point that I made before, there's a continuum here. Here we have God saying a particular woman is going to give birth and that child will have a particular name. So we have this idea of women being chosen by God to have special children. Maybe that verse doesn't mean virgin, but it's on the continuum.
Thank you. All right, I'll let you get back to your sources.
Okay, back to our story, such as it is. All right, so I think, given the time constraints, rather than look further at some of the other examples, because you get the basic idea, I will summarize one other conflict between the Gospels and the Toledot Yeshu, which is a fascinating one. So after Jesus was taken down from the cross, he was buried. According to Matthew, the Jews went to Pilate and said, "We want to set up a guard at Jesus' tomb because we're afraid that his followers will remove Jesus from the tomb and then claim that he has risen." So what happens? They set up a guard, but then when the grave is opened, which isn't, it's really a cave that has a stone in front of it. So when the stone is rolled away, lo and behold, Jesus isn't there. So posting the guards didn't help. The fact is, without anyone entering the cave, Jesus was not in the cave. And then, of course, shortly after that, he appears to the women who had come to dress his body, and later on in the Galilee to some of his disciples, and describes himself as having both spiritual and physical form. So that's the gospel version. The Toledot Yeshu version is that that Jesus was not in his grave because a follower of the Pharisees removed his body from that grave, lest the followers of Jesus somehow retrieve that body, hide it, and then claim that Jesus was resurrected. I understand exactly what this guy was thinking, a little bit off. And then the followers of Jesus say, aha, you see, Jesus was resurrected. The rabbis search out this person who is named Judah or Judas. He tells them, yeah, I took out the body. And they say, well, that's great, but we need the body right now to prove that Jesus wasn't resurrected. They drag Jesus' body through the streets of Jerusalem and bring the body to either Pilate or to a Queen Helena. Her identity is not entirely clear. Helena was the mother of Constantine. There was also a queen of Adiabene, which was near the area of the Caspian Sea. A number of royalty in that community converted to Judaism, and according to the rabbis, Helena came to Jerusalem. Anyway, the point is, for the followers of Jesus, it's simple. He was in the grave, we open up the grave, not there, obviously he was resurrected, especially because of these subsequent visions. Toledot Yeshu says, yeah, his body wasn't there. The reason his body wasn't there was that his body was removed by Judas the gardener, and eventually his body was brought back, and it was made clear that he was never resurrected. Okay, so here's the point before we go on to our next section. In many ways, the Gospels and the Talmud and Toledot Yeshu agree on certain facts. Jesus performed wonders. Jesus' body wasn't in his grave. His grave was open. But the interpretation of those facts is very different. And that's why I call this a form of anti-gospel. Now, what is the next stage? The next stage is that, going down quite a bit here. Yeah. The Christians really didn't know much about the Talmud. Why should they? It was in Aramaic and Hebrew. There weren't too many Hebraists around. It was, as you know, a very dense, it is a very dense document. But in the 13th century, through a number of apostates who knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak. In other words, they knew about passages in the Talmud that Christians would find problematic, including passages that we have seen already, and we'll see a few others that insulted Jesus. They shared the existence of these passages with the clerics, who were infuriated, and as a result, in 1240, the Christian clerics and royalty called Jewish leaders to a disputation. And basically, it was a interrogation of the rabbis, citing these problematic passages and asking them to account for them. And we'll see that the rabbis had to do some fancy dancing to account for that. So the first passage is, you can't quite see the first line, the Talmud contains blasphemies against Jesus. The Talmud says that Jesus is in hell and his punishment is to be immersed in boiling excrement. Well, That's not a very complimentary statement about Jesus. So what does Rabbi Yechiel, who was one of the Tosafists and was sort of the lead defense lawyer in this disputation, for the last 15 years since you were separated from us, you have sought to ensnare us, but you will not succeed. And when he says the last 15 years, I should have explained that in every disputation that took place between the church and Jews, their inquisitor was an apostate, because again, this is the person who would know the passages that would be embarrassing. And the Christian inquisitor or advocate was named Nicholas Donin, and he was an apostate. So that's what it means, 15 years. In other words, you, Nicholas Donin, have been an apostate for 15 years, but you're not going to succeed here. What's his explanation? This Jesus mentioned here by the Talmud is another Jesus, not the one whom Christians worship. This was a certain Jesus who mocked the words of the sages and believed only in the written scripture, like you. You can tell this because he is not called Jesus of Nazareth, but simply Jesus. Okay, if you want to buy that one, be my guest. But obviously, this is some, as I said, fancy dancing. He's in a tight spot and he does the best that he can. So Dona now says, very well, I will read out a passage which does say Jesus of Nazareth in the Bavli Sanhedrin 43a. Churchmen, give your attention to this and see how this people which lives amongst you despises your deity. The Talmud says, when Jesus went forth to be stoned, a herald went out before him for 40 days crying, Jesus the Nazarene goes forth to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed to idolatry and perverted others of Israel. And then in accordance with capital law, according to the rabbis, they needed to say, anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and speak in his favor. They accorded this to Jesus as they would have for anyone who had been sentenced to death. Now, there's something amazing in this Talmudic passage. Most of us are used to saying, well, it's not really the Jews who killed Jesus. It was really the Romans who killed Jesus. Yes, the Sanhedrin interrogated Jesus, but they certainly didn't do the deed. The rabbis of the Talmud are owning the execution of Jesus. But what they are doing is saying, we have no problem saying that we executed Jesus because, according to our lights, he deserved it. Not because he was the Son of God or whatever, because he was a blasphemer and he took Jews away. He diverted Jews away from true worship. So there it is. The rabbis of the Talmud said, yeah, absolutely, we did kill him. But it was based on Jewish law, and therefore it was totally legitimate. Okay, needless to say, this is a problem for Yechiel. And in the record we have of the disputation, we don't have an answer. And there is a similar passage, which Donin quotes now. We don't need to go through each and every accusation. You can read it as your leisure. Again, I have my eye on the clock. But so the story we have here is that the offending passages come to light. The rabbis do their best to explain them away. But in the end of the day, the Christians, the clerics and royalty is not convinced. And shortly after this disputation in 1240, many, many volumes of the Talmud and other sacred Jewish books are burned in Paris as being heretical books. Similarly, there's a disputation in 1263 between Nachmanides, and another apostate. What's it called again? Pablo Christianity. He used to be Joshua Lorca, used to be a rabbi actually. And shortly after that disputation began a process of censorship and destruction of volumes of the Talmud. These strategies that were used by the Christians. Censorship of were printed in Italy. So in the 16th century, some popes said burn the Talmud, some said censor the Talmud. And I want to show you in manuscript, we're going back up now. Here we go. This page is from the only complete manuscript of the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud that we have. And this particular page is from Sanhedrin 43b, which contains the story about the Sanhedrin executing Jesus. Now, in the place where that story should appear, you will see that lines have been erased, either by some church censor or the Jews themselves realizing that if this story is discovered, some Christian discovers this story being present in the Bavli, erased it themselves. And we have many such manuscripts. And we should add that if you look at a standard printed Talmud today, none of these passages appears in the Talmud. It's only now that in some printed editions, they're being restored for better or for worse. Okay, let's see if there are any more questions because I want to go on to another topic.
Okay. Just on a technical note, you're occasionally freezing, so maybe you could hide self-view, which sometimes cuts down bandwidth. Do you know how to do that?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, well, what you just said right at the end was significant. That censorship, the censorship could have been by non-Jewish authorities or by Jews themselves as a measure.
Yes.
A protection measure.
Absolutely.
So that's not really censorship at all. It's a totally different thing.
Well, it's often called self-censorship.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes we say we censor what we say to people. I don't want to get into, I don't want to quibble here. But the point is, and if we talk about the topic of censorship as a whole, whether it's by outside authorities or by self-censorship, you are changing the number of voices that is available within the community. I mean, today we have books that are seen, particularly in the Haredi community, as problematic, and the books are either the author is put into cherem, a ban is put on him, or the books are destroyed, or in various ways, Haredi authorities make sure that the public is not able to read these books. Now, it's true, that's more like censorship, someone censoring someone else. But I mention that simply in the sense that censorship, whether a person feels the need to censor oneself or whether one is being censored by some outside force, is diminishing the dialogue. At the risk of getting into politics, which I definitely don't want to get into, but think of the term cancel culture. that term is talking about two phenomena. One is someone says something that others find objectionable, and they try to silence that person. Two is, I already see down the road that if I say X, Y, and Z, there's a good chance that I'm going to be lambasted, and therefore I don't say it. These are two sides of the same coin. And that was true of the censorship of problematic passages as well.
Right. I guess what I was focusing on is the motivations are different, right? We call the series dangerous ideas. So, right, an idea from the outside, you can censor someone else's idea because it's right. You don't want that idea circulating. You don't want anyone thinking that idea, and you can self-censor with complete confidence of your idea, but you're right. But you want to sort of protect yourself.
Right. It's dangerous in a different sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Duly noted.
Okay. Someone asked if the rabbis' refutations were based on they're actually reading the Gospels, or would that have been heretical? How do they? Or is it just kind of everyone knows all this stuff about Jesus? How do they know all this?
That's an excellent question. Particularly in the case of Toledot Yeshu, there is so much information that seems to come straight out of the Gospels that this suggests that the authors or the sources on which Toledot Yeshu was based is coming from people who are, in fact, familiar with the Gospels. In the case of the anti-Jesus passages in the Talmud, it's a little less clear, but Jews knew and were interested in knowing about what the Christian Bible had to say, in part because they wanted to be able to offer a counter narrative. You can't really offer a counter narrative if you don't know what the narrative is that you're countering. So yes, the implicit evidence is that yes, the people writing these anti-gospels did have familiarity, certainly with the Gospels, if not with the entire New Testament. I mean, since you mentioned this, I have limited. I'm very conflicted as to, but this is, I mean, amazing, and I think you'll find this quite interesting. We know that Paul is the one who talks about Christians not being bound by the law. That's not at all in the Gospels. Quite the contrary. Jesus never says anything like that. He may disagree with the Pharisees as to what the law is, but he is a person bound by law. So Paul is the one who first introduces this idea that you being a Christian actually can mean being freed from the burden of law. It's complicated. Paul himself felt that he had to follow the law. It's too complicated to talk about now, but that part we know. In many versions of Toledot Yeshu, it is claimed that the Jews deputized someone either by the name of Eliyahu. In some versions, it's Shimon Petra, Simon Peter. And what they tell this guy is, the Christians are claiming to be Jews. We need to separate the two communities. So he's a mole, and he goes out and he tells the Christians, I got this message from God that we should no longer observe the laws of the Torah. We believe in Jesus, and according to one version, he says, here are holidays. We're going to make up these new holidays that we're going to observe, like the birth date of Jesus. And so the fact that the Christian community becomes separated from the Jewish community, according to Toledot Yeshu, is not because a follower of Jesus decided that this was the true meaning of the of what becomes Christianity, but because Jews made sure that that happened so that Jews and Christians, so again, it's a perfect example of clearly they're aware in some way of the role of Paul, but they turn it on its head. Okay. I really want to get to some more uplifting stuff. So if I may, I'm going to share the screen again. So we've seen offensive passages in the Talmud. We've seen that there is Toledot Yeshu, which contains this, what I keep calling an anti-gospel. We've seen that at a certain point, the Christians become aware of it and the rabbis have to justify it somehow. But there's no reason to think that in their own hearts, the rabbis reject what these passages say. It's just for general consumption, they are arguing that these are not really offensive or meant to offend Jesus of Nazareth. It's somebody else, okay? Now, we come to, so now we're moving to, we're still in the medieval period. In the medieval period, especially among the, not so much in Ashkenaz, but in Sfarad, meaning in the Iberian Peninsula, both in Muslim Spain early on, and much of the Iberian Peninsula is then conquered by the Christians. So Jews live under both Muslims and Christians. Among the philosophically oriented scholars, Jewish scholars, there is a change, there is a shift, which is to say, they begin to see a value in Christianity, and the hostility towards Christianity and towards Jesus is moderated and starts to turn in a different direction. I want to look particularly at a passage in Mishnah Torah, in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, which, it should be mentioned, itself was censored. And the passage, this is at the end of the Laws of Kings and their wars, where Jesus is talking about what will happen in the Messianic era and how we will know that whoever claims to be the Messiah actually is. And he says, Jesus of Nazareth, who aspired to be the Mashiach and was executed by the court, was also alluded to in Daniel's prophecies, as it says in Daniel chapter 11:14, the vulgar among your people shall exalt themselves in an attempt to fulfill the vision, but they shall stumble. And he then says, can there be a greater stumbling block than Christianity? Notice that Maimonides is saying Jesus may have, misled the Jewish people and all of that, but Jesus is part of the divine plan. The appearance of Jesus is part of the divine plan, not just something terrible that happens to the Jewish people. So that already is interesting. And he goes on to explain why Jesus can't possibly be the Messiah. He led people away from the Torah, he died, and all of that. But now he says, nevertheless, the intent of the creator of the world is not within the power of man to comprehend, for his ways are not our ways, nor are his thoughts our thoughts. Ultimately, all the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth and that Ishmaelite who rose after him will only serve to prepare the way for Mashiach's coming and the improvement of the entire world. And now I just want to skip down to the next paragraph. How will this come about? The entire world has already become filled with the mention of the Messiah, Torah, and mitzvot. In other words, both through the advent of Jesus and Christianity and the advent of Muhammad and Islam, to the extent that these religions are founded in Judaism, they talk about the concept of Mashiach, the importance of Torah, the importance of mitzvot, right? Religious commandments in whatever way. Then he goes on to explain that they understand Torah mitzvot in a different way. But nonetheless, they are preparing the world to accept the Messiah at the end of days. This is fantastic. You know, Christians, this idea really developed in the 4th century. Talked about something called the preparation of evangelism. What they said was, the reason that God gave the Jewish people Torah was to prepare them and the world for the advent of Jesus. In other words, when Jesus comes, he explains to us the true meaning of the Bible, whereas until his time, the Jews only had a superficial understanding of the Bible. But they had studied the Bible, and since they were familiar with it, when Jesus came, they were prepared to accept Jesus and Jesus' teaching. Of course, historically speaking, not so much. So Maimonides is flipping that on its head and saying the existence of Christianity and Islam is a preparation for the ultimate victory, the coming of the Messiah, and everyone flocking to the Messiah and the Jewish people and acknowledging the truth of the Jewish Messiah, the Jewish people, and their Torah. So this isn't exactly a ringing endorsement of Jesus, but at least it is a move towards seeing Jesus as part of the divine plan, have contributed something positive to sacred history. We're going to look at 2 more sources quickly. In the 20th and 21st century, we finally come to an unreservedly positive view of Jesus. This first excerpt is from a speech that was given by Rabbi Stephen Wise on Sunday, it should say December 16, 1924, a very controversial sermon in which he suggested that Jews have to reclaim Jesus as a rabbi and reclaim his true teachings, in other words, the teachings that appear in the gospel, for themselves. And let's just look at the 3rd paragraph. I do not need to be a Christian in order to recognize the place of Jesus in the great Jewish tradition. Israel gave Jesus the man and the Jew to humankind. And he argues rather daringly, for the most part, Christendom has denied him indeed, though affirming him in name. In other words, he's saying the Christianity of his own day and throughout much of history really did not live by the teachings of Jesus. Is not the hour come for us, fellow Jews, to place Jesus where he belongs, this radiant Jewish teacher in Palestine of the 1st century? Many, many people were outraged and upset by this sermon. And he actually, Wise actually had to step down from the chairmanship of the United Palestine Appeal as a result of giving this sermon. But what he is saying is something interesting and in a way daring, which is whatever Christians came to say about Jesus, we are going to go back to the beginning, to the original Jesus, and to argue that that original Jesus and those original teachings come from Jewish sources and are totally compatible with Jewish religion, and more than that, can be looked to as inspiration and teaching. We should add, it probably was easier for a rabbi of the Reform movement to say this than rabbis of other movements. Martin Buber, who was not particularly positively disposed towards halachic Judaism, also speaks glowingly of Jesus. But this is something very, very different from what has happened before. And finally, in 2015, an Orthodox group which works with Christian groups and tries to attain harmony and mutual understanding says something rather amazing, well, is to me. As did Maimonides and Yehuda Halevi, we acknowledge that the emergence of Christianity in, in human history is neither an accident or an error, but the will divine outcome and gift to the nations. Now notice, he's starting off sounding like Maimonides, right? The appearance of Christianity is part of God's plan. But what is the purpose of Christianity appearing? Not to prepare people to accept the Jewish Messiah in the end of days, but to serve as a positive force, a gift to the nations, to enlighten and inspire the nations to live in a godly way. I mean, I'm putting in some words there, but I think that's the intention. In separating Judaism and Christianity, God willed a separation between partners with significant theological differences, not a separation between enemies. In other words, it's a division of labor. The Jewish covenant was meant to hold Jews to one form of divine service. Jesus was put in the world to bring the rest of humanity to divine service in a way different from the way of Judaism, but no less important. I have to say, I grew up in the Orthodox movement. If someone had told me when I was growing up in the 60s that there was going to be a statement like this, I would say, what are you smoking? I mean, it's just, amazing to me and heartening that we have come to a point in history where many of us are able to talk about Jesus and his fundamental teachings as something that grows out of Jewish teaching and that has a value. And I think they mean even Paul's teachings have a value in making the world a godly place. Christians are partners with us in doing this. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to hear questions and comments.
That's astounding what you just shared.
Yeah.
So would you?
I wanted to send.
Yeah.
I wanted to end on something uplifting. I think that's important.
Well, and throwing us all for a loop. So do you think that is there really a substantive difference between that last source and the previous one, or is it just that the time was so different that people that it's just heard so differently?
Well, I think that Rabbi Wise was making a more modest claim. The claim that he was making was that Jesus can be seen as a rabbi who offers Jewish teachings, and therefore, as a rabbi, his teachings can be valuable to the Jews. What the Orthodox group is claiming is that Jesus is a prophet sent out to the world in accordance with God's plan, and therefore is a partner with the rabbis of the Jewish world. They just have different pulpit. They just have a different audience. I think that's a much broader claim than what Wise was saying.
Mm-hmm. What is this? The CJC?
Yeah, I forget what the abbreviation is. Sorry, I meant to look it up before, but I can't.
Okay, a couple of people asked about that, so we will.
People who are interested should be able to Google and find it.
Okay, great. Okay, so every 15 minutes or so, someone has said, wait a second, so they're not, like, the Jewish sources are not disputing that Jesus was a historical figure. I think my sense is that you have, that definitively, based on what you've said, they're not disputing he was around, that you said at the beginning that they sort of want to claim him. He was, to the extent that characters mentioned in rabbinic sources are people who we think of as historical, Jesus is of a piece with that.
So I'm glad you asked that. I want to show you a book that will be very valuable to you if you want to know more about the question about the anti-Jesus passages in the Talmud. It's called Jesus in the Talmud by Peter Schaefer. Okay, but now let me ask the following. Did rabbis assume, and the authors of Toledot Yeshu and the anti-Jesus passages assume that Jesus was a historical figure? Yeah. What we have to add is that whereas in the past, many scholars have mined these sources to try and recover historical events or facts about Jesus. In other words, imagining that the rabbis had a different tradition of what happened back then than the Gospels. Schaefer says, you're wasting your time. Just as the Gospels themselves are not a record. Somebody was hanging out with Jesus and they wrote down everything that happened and it's an accurate record. No, this was after the fact, a literary creation that presented Jesus in a certain way, and each gospel in a somewhat different way. And did these contain historical truths? I'm going to assume that they did, but that wasn't the point. The point was to convey Jesus' message. Similarly, when we look at the anti-Jesus passages in the Talmud or in Toledot Yeshu, did the rabbis have a tradition that Jesus' mother was known by the name Satta, or his father was Papus ben Yehuda? I don't think so. I think what happens is, because Jews feel the need to react, they create their own narrative, drawing information or inspired by Christian sources and perhaps other sources. So we're talking about dueling literary creations, which at heart may be talking about a historical figure, but are not based on as told to or interviews or historical documents.
Thanks. So I'm thinking about, I'm trying to compare the different, I know you said you didn't want to talk about politics, which is fine. I'm trying to compare the different phenomena that you've shared with us today with maybe some contemporary analogs, sort of the censorship versus self-censorship and the different motivations there. And I think especially really what you talked about in the rabbinic period with kind of agreeing on certain core facts, but interpreting them so differently and ridiculing them to try to advance,
Right.
advance one's own reading. I don't know if you want to, do you see those? Do you see examples of those strategies at play around us today?
The ridicule?
The ridicule and particularly, right, the alternative facts has become this phrase that we use since it was first coined, but often there is something in common between the fact and the alternative fact. There's some kernel there, and there's
Yeah, but I would say in the sources we've studied, the difference is they agree on certain facts and interpret those facts very differently. That's the point. I watched Stephen Colbert, and the reason that I watch Stephen Colbert is A, he's funny, and B, because I get very depressed about the state of politics. And therefore, it's a guilty pleasure for me, since I think we're all talking past each other. At the very least, I can enjoy somebody, for the most part, ridiculing people with whom I disagree. That's the guilty pleasure. Does it make the world a better place? Does it make us speak more to each other? And probably is counterproductive in that respect. And that's how I would describe the anti-Jesus passages. They weren't about convincing Christians of anything. They were about Jews telling themselves that we don't have to engage the Christians and start talking about theology and differences. We know that it's nonsense. Their very founder, Jesus himself, is nothing like what the Christians describe. So it reflects an unfortunate reality where people are not speaking to each other. And they substitute for that ridicule of the other side. And believe me, Christians were not shy about doing the same thing throughout history. It's sad, it's unfortunate, which is why I wanted to have a chance to look at Maimonides, Stephen Wise, and the group of Orthodox rabbis. The point being, there is another path that we can walk down. And I know I said I wouldn't get into politics, and I think this is a pretty safe statement that I'm going to make here. Would it be the case that today, A, people would share an agreement about basic facts, and B, find a way of speaking to each other in which they entertain the possibility that the other party might have something to teach them, which is very rarely what goes on in political dialogue. And if that were so, which is going on, I think, in this statement of the Orthodox group, the opportunity to really work together is there. I'm not an idiot. I'm not. I know the odds of this happening are slim to none in any broad sense, but I'm challenging myself and us to think about what are the forums, even in a modest way, in which we can make that happen. And are we willing to listen to people with whom we utterly disagree in a search for something in what they're saying that could be instructive to me? That is the possible gift, the opportunity that we can take away from the last source that we looked at.
Thank you. And I think, what you were saying about, late night TV, it's interesting, right? That, maybe there's kind of an outlet for, or a need to kind of get the judgmental, ridiculing piece out somewhere, but maybe you do that sort of in your own circumscribed place, and that's not when you're actually trying to create a connection with the other, that's not the place to bring that out. And I think that it's consistent with what you shared at the beginning, that these sources of these Talmudic sources, they were for a Jewish audience. They weren't. Yes. Now they're sort of there for the whole world to see, but that's not who they were actually intended for.
It was, as we say today, an echo chamber.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, so I hope everyone will forgive me my guilty pleasure watching Colbert, but I really do think that much more important is finding common ground in some shape or form. And I'm sure many of us, most of us, perhaps all of us would agree.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was, I think, quite helpful set of analogies for what we're seeing around us today in I think a lot of ways that we might not have expected, and just a whole new set of nuanced sources and kind of understandings of what was at play in these sources. So thank you so much for putting this all together and teaching us today. Thank you once again to our sponsors, Lenore and Rabbi Melvin Cerner, in memory of Rabbi Amy Mayer. And we hope to see you all next week, where we will be picking up on the Maimonides theme with Dr. Alan Middleman, who's professor of Jewish philosophy here. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Rabbi Diamond, for teaching, and hope to see you all again soon.
Okay.
And don't forget to vote.